right now. Okay, we are recording, so let's get started. So we don't have that many people here, so if you'd like to interrupt at any time, please just do so. These were slides that Rebecca and I created for an earlier presentation. We've updated them a little bit since then, but we thought it was good to review this because this was put together really quickly at the start of the pandemic when we moved to remote instruction, and I think we still need all that stuff.
Yeah, so you know, I think challenge for a lot of people moving, or teaching in an online modality is ensuring that their learning activities are substantial and having the outcomes that we intend to have. And so incorporating, there's lots of ways we can incorporate active learning in our online synchronous classrooms. So thinking about, having a flip style online synchronous session, is often assumed in active learning. Did you want to?
And basically, we put these slides together with the assumption that flipped is a way a lot of people were going to go at the start of the pandemic. And in general, it is a way that has been documented to be a bit more effective. One of the worst things you can do, and the most common and easiest way to teach a remote class, is to lecture to students. And when students are being lectured to in class, when they don't have as many distractions, it can work a little bit, at least in terms of short-term recall for some students. But in terms of remote instruction, when you're at home,
I mean, it was good. I was glad to see it, but I was just like, oh, I'm glad I saw
really
it. I have to figure out how.
It is really easy to tune people out when you're sitting at home and there's other things to distract you. So it's really easy to lose students if you're just going to lecture at them for more than a few minutes. So we're going to assume that that's not what most people are doing, and I don't think it's what most people have been doing. But so that's why we start with that assumption. And the main reason for this is that the easiest stuff for students to do is to learn some basic terms and concepts in the reading. The challenging stuff for students is when they have to actually apply the material. So with a flipped classroom, you end up doing the more challenging things in the synchronous class meeting. So basically, and that's a really good way of engaging students with active learning technique, to let them do the basic readings before your class meetings, and then work on applications where you can get them actively engaged in this, where they can try things, where they experiment with the tools that they have learned, and you can give them feedback, and the peers can give them feedback.
Yeah. And, it's a good way to kind of encourage creativity and curiosity, thinking about how those activities are expanding upon the knowledge that they've already received, either through readings or through videos that they've watched, previously before coming to, their online synchronous meetings. The other, benefit of active learning is it provides a lot of opportunities for reflection. So, allowing students to not only, practice the material that they've, spent time previously learning, but also giving them the opportunity to reflect on, what more they're interested in, or what points they still need clarity on, and using class time specifically to address those questions.
So things are different, as we've all discovered when we move remote. And one of the major issues was the issues of that black wall of Zoom faces on there. There's a lot of reasons to not require students to turn their cameras on. Students, when they're working remotely, especially when it wasn't by choice because they were in quarantine or they got sent home or something similar, many students were trying to connect from really old computers, some of which don't have web cameras. Very often students were in shared living quarters where they were in a living room or perhaps some other kitchen or dining room or some other area where there would often be 3 or 4 other people around. And students didn't want to necessarily invite the world to come into their homes while they were working.
Yeah.
And that effect was disproportionately felt by students from low-income households, where particularly in cities where there's denser living situations, where there are more people sharing living quarters. And for low-income students, they might be embarrassed about the quality of their homes compared to, students from wealthier suburbs and so forth. So that was an issue that, many people complained about. Some people required cameras, but that may not be an optimal situation, especially when students are in very unequal circumstances.
Similarly, when people join meetings, often they're joining and their microphone is off on entry. So, a lot of those kind of conversations and connections students were making with each other before class, or, questions that they might have had, we're now kind of in this environment that doesn't necessarily facilitate that in the same way. And so, thinking about, setting that tone, for engagement. And there's a lot of considerations that, when you're teaching in a synchronous session online, you want to, think about, for the environment you're trying to cultivate for your course.
And in terms of the microphone off on entry, the main issue is if you don't do that, students will come in at random times. And we see this all the time with faculty, much more so than with students actually, with the microphone open while they're on the phone or talking to other people.
Sure.
Them. So we've had that many times. And you can set the default settings on Zoom to have microphones off by default when people come into the room, and encourage students to turn them on. And if you go to the participant screen in Zoom, you can choose mute all if you don't have it set as a default, and then ask students to turn them back on when they wish to speak. But the background noise can get really challenging, especially if you're teaching, as I was doing that first semester remote, there was about 289 students all sharing this one big Zoom room. And, there'd be a lot of noise if they didn't default to microphone off. But set the tone for how you'd like students to engage. Talk to students about the ways in which they'll be able to engage. If you're in a larger class, you might not want to use talk as a major way of communicating. You might want to use things like chatterfall is a term that's been used, or 1, 2, 3, go, where you ask students a question, but you post a question in chat, then you ask them to type in a response, but wait until you ask for the response and then have them all submit them at once. So it's sort of like a post-first discussion forum, in an online course, but you get all the responses at once and you can skim through them, and students can see through them, can skim through them, and you get responses from all the students as a way of engagement. You could also use back channel apps. You could use chat, you could use Slack, you could use Google Chat or other tools as a way of letting students engage with each other, share information, and so on. So it's important to let students know that you want them to be engaged and talk about ways in which that can work. In small classes, let the microphones be on all the time.
Sure.
And ask them to mute it if they're going to have some distracting noise. But in larger classes, you'll want to use other forms of interaction.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And, there's reactions, you can have the raise the hand function, so to talk about, what options are available for students is a really
And you might want to use some
tool.
of the polling tools or other things to get regular interactions or feedback on how students are doing, et cetera. And you want to make sure, especially at the beginning of class, that you set up an inclusive and comfortable environment and let students know you want to hear their voices, even if it's not necessarily the voice coming over the microphone or over the headphone constantly. Let them know you want to hear it, but give them talk about ways in which they can engage with a class. And talk about other things you could do like whiteboards and so forth, and set the terms for that early on. Okay. Here we go.
Excellent. So there's lots of ways you can have students assess prior knowledge during your online synchronous courses. So using polling tools and technology, so you can have students access third-party tools for that, like Poll Everywhere. There's also polling.
I would not recommend poll everywhere because it's really expensive, or anything other than, I think it's up to 5 or 10 people or something.
Oh, okay.
We do have a contract with iClicker, so you
Gotcha.
probably should use iClicker because it's free to students and it scales to any level.
Gotcha. It wasn't always that way, was it? Poll everywhere.
For the last year and a half.
Oh, okay,
Poll
so-
everywhere has always been expensive. Maybe it may be limited to 15 free.
Yeah.
but
Interesting. All right. So, Zoom, which a lot of people have been using, has some kind of polling, software there. So that's, an option, particularly if you're just trying to get, just sensibilities or, sense of what the students are feeling in that moment. It doesn't necessarily allow you to assign grades like iClicker does, or, keep track of students' participation in that way, but that's an option. Using whiteboards. So we've talked about Jamboard a lot, as a Google Suite tool that you can use. I believe there's a whiteboard also integrated in Zoom now.
There is.
It's a
And you
new-
can create it
new
separately
feature.
and then load it in. That's a new feature in the last couple of months.
You can certainly use short Google forms, that you can send links out in a chat for students to participate in. You can also create QR codes. So when you're sharing your screen, they can easily access that in a different way. If you choose, you can also facilitate discussions with breakout rooms, which I know a lot of people have used in the past. And so allowing, and, as an instructor, you can jump into different breakout rooms and check in with students about any questions that they have. But, giving students adequate time in discussion groups is also another good way to facilitate assessing this prior knowledge.
And so this is useful both for the students themselves to let them know how they're doing, that if they did some reading, giving them some questions and letting them know whether they were correct or not, is helping them improve their metacognition. It gives them more information about whether what they thought was correct or how they understood their interpretation of the readings, whether that matches the type of understanding you expect them to have. And it also gives you feedback that if you, even in a classroom, if you ask students to respond, to ask them a question, you only hear from one student at a time. And whether that's a class of 10 students or whether it's a class of 400 students, you're only hearing one voice, and you don't know if that student is an outlier as the only student who doesn't understand or the only student that does. By using polling, you get to know instantly how well the entire class understands material. So that assessing prior knowledge is really helpful because it allows you to do some just-in-time teaching to address the areas where students have some conception issues. And one of the really good uses of breakout rooms is that if you're going to poll questions that are relatively challenging, this was a technique that Eric Missouri developed and we've talked about in lots of past workshops. You can poll the students at first, let them vote individually, and then send them to breakout rooms to discuss it. And after they've had a chance to discuss it, you can have them vote again and then ask them to explain their answers. And there's some really significant improvements in student learning when you combine that peer instruction with the feedback that you provide or that other students provide to help clarify that. Because the act of explaining it to other students is really helpful in reinforcing learning.
All right, so, other ways that you can have students explore new concepts or think about, new skills that you want them to work through is including some kind of a pre-class activity. John, do you want to chime in on that too?
Well, the pre-class activities, this was actually something Rebecca had put in the slide, but at the starter class, doing some type of discussion as students are coming in, having them, one of the things she did in particular was have them draw on a whiteboard. It was an art class, so that worked kind of nicely. But what many people have done, and I think Michael has done this to some extent, is start the class by playing music, or maybe playing a video as students wander in that somehow connect to what you're going to be doing later, because it serves as a way of focusing attention. It's also not a bad idea in a large class, because if there is a video or a song playing as students arrive in the class, everyone tends to focus on that, especially if there's a video and you dim the lights a little bit. It's like they're walking into a movie theater and it tends to draw their focus. And it's a good way of getting students centered out of the space they were in into preparing for class. So that's one type, or there's a lot of things you can do, but doing something that's connected to the class that brings everyone to attention and focus might be helpful. Or you could post a question and ask them to respond in chat as they arrive, or do some other activity, which is a nice way of getting them into class as you're getting ready to start the session.
And as Michael mentioned, he said that playing music also, or any other kind of pre-class activities can help, so that the instructor can use that first 5 minutes of class to help the stragglers into the room. So we know that the same can be the case for an online course where you have people chiming in, entering into your rooms late, and so kind of giving a little bit of space for everyone to gather together is a good way to facilitate that. So other tools that we could use to help.
Well, there was a question in chat we should probably go back to. I didn't see it before. Nanda Kumar asked, how do you get proctor's exams if the cameras are closed? Basically, you don't. That, no one has, well, in general, the advice that teaching centers have been giving for a very long time is that remote proctoring of exams is not going to work effectively. That the best thing you can do is give exams in an environment where it limits, if you're going to do online exams, use lots of variations. You may want to limit backtracking. You may want to set time limits and so forth, which makes it really hard to cheat, but it's going to be really difficult to proctoring over the internet does not work well. Whether you force students to pay a lot of money for devices that are really, and software that's really easily defeated, or whether you're trying to watch everything that's happening, it's really easy for students to have other devices that they can use to monitor at the same time. Now, some of the things like AutoLock, which some campuses have bought into, including ours, are really expensive, and it will actually shut down internet access other than this, which makes it really hard if students have a sibling that's trying to participate in a class at the same time on a different device. It's not something that is encouraged anywhere, but I know it's done, and I know some departments are really concerned about that. But what most teaching centers advise is using some types of authentic assessment where it's cheating is less likely. When students are creating projects where they're applying concepts, which again can be more work, so it is a bit of a challenge.
If part of the concern is that you want to be available for students' questions, you can create time where you explain to during the window that exam is available to students, that you'll also be in a Zoom room, where you can share that, meeting room link and have students, jump in if they do have questions about the exam that they're taking. So that's another, aspect of how you can, get around that without, the cameras.
And it is a problem, especially with larger classes, and especially with classes where it's easy for students to ask other people for assistance and get answers really quickly with some of the academic integrity or the services online like Chegg and Study Blue and all the others that are designed basically to facilitate cheating.
Yeah.
Scavenger.
All right. So, other kind of activities you can use, scavenger hunts. I think Rebecca has done this before. Giving, she does a lot of graphic design and website development kind of coursework. So she's used scavenger hunts to, give students kind of a fun activity to, work together in I think she does it in groups too, right?
They can be in groups.
In groups or individually.
Students out on the web
to find things. There's lots of opportunities there. Creating graphic organizers. So, this is, perhaps similar to like a Jamboard or a whiteboard where you can have students concept map out different course concepts and give them time to kind of organize that material. So maybe that's through a timeline. of
Well,
some
and
sort.
with graphic organizers, the research on that is really mixed, that in general, retrieval practice has been found to be dramatically better, even if the students are going to be tested using mind maps and concept maps and so forth. So the research there is a bit questionable, or suggests that the effectiveness is a bit limited. And of course, in graphics, it might be really helpful to have students create graphic organizers. of
Yeah,
some
just
form.
as a practice of that too. So creating timelines, in a similar fashion, having students map out events, throughout whatever material you're using, could be a fun activity for them to do, something they can access tools online to accomplish.
And there are timeline tools that students can create, and you could ask them to investigate the development of some new technology or some concept in your discipline, to look at how ideas evolve. And then you could have those groups go out and use the timeline tools to show how the concepts evolved over time, or how something developed over time. And that's a form of active learning that can be useful in many classes.
So, having them, investigate kind of case studies and observations of different course material and concepts. There's certainly lots of opportunities to send them to research databases, or to find examples of things online, and to report back to their breakout rooms, or to the class as a whole, enter things in the chat, and help them find ways they can exemplify their understanding of material in that way.
And the design challenges is something that Rebecca used, but they're appropriate in some disciplines, where you give students a challenge and ask them to create something where they then get to share them. It could be similar things could be done in classes where people are creating short videos to explain concepts that they could then share in class, where they're explaining different concepts that, again, they're creating resources that could be used by others. In general, giving students problem sets to work on, often in groups, is a really effective way of leveraging peer instruction as well. Give them some assignments. It could be done in a Google form, as we've mentioned before, and the Google form could be set up as a quiz where you actually grade them and give them back to them and so forth. But when they work on these things together, it's really helpful. Or you could ask them to do the problems individually, then send them to a group where they get to work through it again, or they bring in their own perceptions to the group discussion and activity.
I know for, my classes that I've held synchronous discussion sessions for, I've created like a Google Drive folder, for the class, and I'll share that right away at the beginning of class. And within that are different group activity documents, so that when they are sent into breakout rooms, they all have access to their group's document, and they can kind of talk and add things to that running document. So if it's a problem set or a challenge that they're working on, kind of creating the structure of that. I typically use Google Suite tools to do that. There's certainly other ways you can, give students access to that information, but allowing them to have a space where they can, kind of, add in different information in real time is a good way to help them take notes and document their work.
And then if you give them a problem, like a case study or something similar, or some analysis that you have to do, or talk about how things might evolve, you could then have each group present their arguments at the end, and they can compare and contrast them and ask each other questions and so forth. So you can do this at many different ways or many different levels.
Yeah, and I find just setting that up ahead of time is really easy, and really helps facilitate a lot of those activities, particularly group activities. So other things to think about in your online synchronous instruction is really leaning into peer instruction and cooperative learning techniques. So the Jigsaw Technique is, one way that you can have students kind of piece together larger concepts and ideas in your material by giving each student kind of a piece of that puzzle that they then have to come back together to put together.
Is everyone familiar with the jigsaw?
I guess I should ask.
Either type something in chat or
Give us a thumbs up
Thumbs up.
reaction.
Now, this is like one of those classes. Okay, well, we'll assume that people are familiar with it and we'll move on.
Think, pair, share is another great activity. Again, you can use breakout rooms in Zoom to kind of facilitate this discussion. Fishbowl activities, for just kind of briefly, fishbowl activities when you, kind of you suggest that everyone will have the potential, right, to be called on, or that they might have opportunities to pass, but that a small group facilitates a discussion while others kind of, view and chime in, kind of looking into a fishbowl as it were.
Going back to think, pair, share, that basically with that, this is a really good place where you can use the breakout room. So you just, if you have 30 students, make 15 breakout rooms and send them automatically to those. You may have to have one group of 3 if you have an odd number of students or some odd students in the class. And it allows you to do the same thing. It's just a little clunky, but you can have students automatically sent there. And it becomes, fairly automatic.
Yeah. And, role-playing activities and debates, kind of giving, groups of students different sides of a debate, letting them develop those debates in breakout rooms, and then coming together to, share their thoughts. There's, a lot of fun opportunities, to, have students work together to, either teach each other concepts, or each bring something to the table that they can build upon together.
And the key is to use as much small group activity as you can to keep students actively engaged, because sitting on Zoom listening to people talk, as you is now experiencing, and as you've experienced a lot during these workshops, is not the most engaging way of interacting with material. You could also use some games. Kahoot is one that's really popular, but there's many different types of learning games you could introduce.
Yeah, I've done Jeopardy in my classes. There's, lots of, fun ways to get students in the moment. So
one of the things you can do, though, is you could have students take the knowledge that they've acquired, often outside of class, maybe some of it in class, in the synchronous meetings, and create some work and give each other feedback on it. And one way in which you can do that is through collaborative projects involving either open pedagogy or community-based learning. We had some workshops on open pedagogy before, but the basic notion is you have students create knowledge that they then share with others. A common sort of project in college classes is for college students to create videos, explanatory materials, sometimes edited books, or collect materials that is shared for either other students as learning resources, either other college students, or is shared for high schools and so forth, to create materials that will be useful for others. And when you work together to put a video together on the concept, you're going to learn that much more deeply, and it's going to be much more engaging than trying just to read it yourself or just trying to take tests on it. Students tend to remember these things much more vividly than the typical types of things they've done over and over throughout their education. Community-based learning projects, because they activate emotions, because you're creating a public service that has some benefit to the community, it's going to, again, be a really engaging way of applying your knowledge in disciplines where there are appropriate, where you can come up with appropriate types of projects. And if you think carefully about it, you're likely to be able to find ways of doing some community-based learning for many disciplines, if not all disciplines.
Sure.
I suppose if you're in veterinary medicine and you're in New York City, it may not work quite as well, but most things I think can have some service-based learning or community-based learning projects available.
All right, so kind of giving students an opportunity to put their knowledge into to display their understanding of the course materials. You can have students present their work. You can have students publish their work in various ways. John was kind of talking about some of this with open pedagogy. having them create videos or text or podcasts or ways that they can display their understanding of the material in various published forms. If you attended the workshop session with Jessamine Newhouse on the essay, she talks about having a gallery walk of students, different work. So in a similar way, you can have students sort of show and tell and display their projects with each other in kind of an exhibition format.
As a culminating project, either for a portion of the class or for the class as a whole.
Virtual poster sessions, also, lots of opportunities for that in a synchronous session as well. You could have students, jump into different breakout rooms and ask their peers different questions. So you can make it as, like a in-person poster session as you like.
And in chat, Nathan Kumar suggested that computer-based interactive learning is very useful, and adaptive learning platforms, which are offered by many publishers, are extremely effective. And one of the nice things about them is they do tend to reduce some of the equity gaps that we observe. That in general, the students who benefit, no one is harmed by using an adaptive learning or personalized learning platform, because students are being able to learn more efficiently, because the focus in that, when they're working one-on-one with a computer, is basically on creating a learning path that's based on the individual student's needs. And we can think of that as having essentially like a book that is giving students the content that's most effective. That's not really what we're focusing on here, though, because that's something that they should be doing outside of class and working on it, because that allows them to work at their own pace to get to the level of understanding where they can engage more productively in other activities. But in general, adaptive learning and personalized learning platforms increase learning for everyone, but they disproportionately increase learning for students who are first-gen students, for students from lower income households, and from students who are in groups that are minoritized.
Yeah, and it's a good tool to incorporate in your flipped classrooms. So that students are reviewing that material, especially the material that they need more work on, and before coming into class.
And SUNY does have free personalized learning tools from Lumen, from the Lumen Learning Waymaker service, but they also have worked with Carnegie Mellon's Open Learning Initiative to use their adaptive learning platforms, and they've been documented to be remarkably effective in closing some of those equity gaps.
So other kinds of activities you can incorporate in your online synchronous courses include exit tickets or 1-minute papers. So if those of you who don't know, asking students to, talk about what points that they found to be, interesting, or what points they wanted more clarity on, any questions that they still had, so whether they're doing this in kind of a form, like on a short Google form, or they're writing out a text and sending that to you in a particular format, giving them opportunities for reflection can, really keep that engagement right till the very end of class.
And also those reflective activities in general have been shown to increase student long-term recall. That the simple act of just reflecting on what you just learned tends to increase the amount that students remember immediately in the next class day, as well as in terms of their overall grade in the course. So, and not in all the studies, but no study has found these reflective activities to have a negative effect. And many of the studies, there have been several in economics, have found significant learning gains by just asking students to use that exit ticket thing, also known as the muddiest point, or there's a lot of names that are given to it, where you just ask students, what do I understand? What have you learned that day? What did you not fully understand? What would you like to learn more of? And there's an example on the left that I think Rebecca had used.
Yeah, and that looks like it's a Jamboard image, or image of, a Jamboard where students can type in, little sticky notes
I think those were actually sticky notes.
Oh,
on
are
the
they
whiteboard,
actual? Yeah, so sticky notes on a whiteboard, right? So, gives students opportunity to share anonymously if you're using Jamboard, which, can be really helpful for students who are, fearing, sharing something that they're still stuck on.
And even if you're doing a large class, I've used this in classes of up to 420, a short Google form asking the same things, where you just share the QR code for that with students in class. They can do it in the phone. It literally takes just a minute or two. And it comes into a spreadsheet, and you can scan through that. And then you can start the next class by focusing on the areas that students found most confusing. And you'll see some pretty common patterns.
Yeah.
The same ones every year quite often, because some concepts are just a little more challenging than others, but it does seem to be helpful. And it also shows that you're responsive to what their needs are.
And beyond that, you can, have students, create journals or discussion posts, in your LMS to kind of, clarify, any points that they still have questions on, or, asking them to reflect on their learning, at the end of class or following class.
And the journal blog option is something that we do have available if you want to try soon create. You can create your own WordPress site and have students and add all the students as a member. As of now, that's still free, and it's not a bad tool. I know a lot of people have been using it in some cases for a decade or more. So if it's something you want to try, let me know and we can get you connected with an account. The Metacognitive Cafe discussion forum is something I've used for about 7 or 8 years now. And it's basically just a low stakes discussion forum for in my online classes, where students reflect on their learning. It's sort of like a journal, except they're sharing their thoughts with others. And one of the things that's happened is it creates much more of a sense of community, because when students share concerns about having trouble understanding some concept, or using graphs, or using certain mathematical techniques, it makes other students feel a bit more included, who no longer feel like they're the only one who's struggling with this. And they can share strategies that they've used to work through those problems. And it really has been remarkably effective in building that sense of community and letting students get to know each other, and also letting you to get to know the students a bit better. They'll often bring in examples from their lives of how these concepts apply and some of the challenges they're facing. And those will come up in the other discussion forums that focus on content.
All right, so finally, virtual online synchronous sessions can offer us lots of options that we wouldn't necessarily get to have in a face-to-face classroom. So it's much easier to facilitate guest speakers, particularly, people who you have access to online that you may not be able to have come in face-to-face. You have lots of options to use the chat either within Zoom or other apps like John had talked about, Slack, and I'm sure there's many others that are escaping my mind right now. But you can have students, discuss with each other as a back channel. You can use the breakout rooms. So you didn't used to get to send students to different rooms to talk about things, but now you can really allow for very focused discussions without that distractions by using those breakout rooms.
And one of the things we all experienced was some of the challenges when students were remote, but these are things we didn't have before. And one thing that's really handy is when students are stuck on something, if they share their screen, you can generally resolve it so much more easily, even than if they were in the classroom and just reporting on a problem they had while they were working outside of class. So if the student's saying, I'm having trouble getting the statistical package to do this, you just ask them to share their screen, or I'm having connecting to this, have them share their screen and walk through it. And that'll also be helpful for other students who might get to do that. We also have, I never had to use this, but we also have in Zoom the ability, if you enable it, to do remote desktop control, so that if a student is having some technical problems, you can ask them if they're willing to give you the rights to it, and you can resolve it essentially the way help desks do it when we contact the help desk. And the ability to share links in real time is really handy. One of the things I often will do is I'll have a list I often do this for work. When I'm working from home, it was really easy because I had 2 screens regularly. But having a screen where I had a text document with a list of URLs that I would just drop into chat whenever I want students to look at something, that didn't work as well when we're in the classroom. You can do it in the classroom using QR codes, but if you want students to look at something on a web browser, it may not always work as well. One of the things that happened at CIT, which surprised me, was there was a group, one of the groups presenting asked people to use a Jamboard that they had put together in advance. They put up a QR code, and then when the people who were in the room scanned the QR code, it asked them to install Jamboard on their mobile devices, because those of us who do that regularly often just have already installed Jamboard and didn't even notice it was doing it, and just assumed that it would work in a browser-based environment. And it does on the computer, but it doesn't with mobile devices. So the ability to share links for something that is web-enabled, such as a Jamboard that only works on a computer, works really well when you're teaching students remotely, but doesn't work so well in the classroom unless all your students download and install Jamboard, which many of them would not have. In fact, I think there were only 3 of us in the room who had Jamboard installed on our mobile devices. Okay, so those are the things we put together. There's so much more, and we wanted to give time for everyone to talk about things they've done to engage in active learning and ways of getting students engaged in remote instruction. What have you done that has worked? We've seen some of you present on this stuff, so we know you've done some interesting and engaging things.
I'll jump in. I did oral exams to circumvent the frustrating exam environment with online situations. And it took a lot of time, but I could really separate the wheat from the chaff. I could really, really tell which students understood it, which students somewhat understood it, and which students didn't understand it at all. And so I did about 6 of those in a semester. And by the end, the students in the bottom were upping their game because they knew in the one-on-one oral test, they were going to have to know what was going on. So it was hard, but it was effective.
That's a great way to completely avoid all the issues with remote exams and all the cheating issues that have become so common.
John, I wanted to ask you if you have any suggestions with regard to very busy expert speakers. You invite them in one of the class, but you can't get them over and over again in repeated classes. Is there any way we can video or do something that can give some kind of evidence?
If you ask them for permission to record their presentation, you can record it in Zoom and then post it on YouTube if they give you permission for that, or in some other way, and then share it with future classes. But the real-time interaction is a real affordance. The ability of students to get this expert speaker coming in that they can ask questions of is really useful. So it's best if you can find someone who's willing to do it multiple times. And sometimes, you know, you might have to buy them lunch or dinner at a conference or something, but often this will work. I know Jessamine and I have traded some workshops where she's given workshops here, and in return, I'm giving some there. You know, if there's some colleague, you know, that you might be able to do the same thing for, where you could present for them in some class and they present for you, having those external speakers is something that students really find engaging.
Right. Yes. Thank you.
And going back to the the oral exams. It's a wonderful technique. It doesn't scale well, and it can put a lot of burden on the instructor, but it's a really good way of getting around that. And in chat, we had a few things. Michelle noted that sharing a Google Doc is helpful to let students share links. And then working together to decide whether the websites they shared were credible sources, having them meet in a group and discuss it. That could be a really useful activity. Lisa mentioned doing a GIS mapping project in a hybrid class, and having the online students in breakout rooms and the face-to-face room students in different groups is something that can work really well. It gets a little bit messy. If you want to do persistent groups, it's a little bit harder if the same students aren't going to all be in the same environment. But having students meet in clusters in the room and in breakout rooms online can work really well if you're doing that type of hybrid environment.
Yeah, well, one of the problem I'm experiencing is that in one of my classes like this, I keep on repeating, please open your cameras. We want to engage. But that does not work by repeated requests either, you know, and I don't know how to have a good percentage of people open up their cameras. You know, I think of their privacy too, but they don't listen.
One thing that you can do, and this shouldn't be a problem for any, is not likely to cause a problem, is just to say, encourage people to, or welcome them to turn their cameras on.
Right.
And a lot of the issue is peer pressure, because there's often half or more of the students who would turn it on. But what will often happen is once they see that a majority of the class has it off, they'll tend to follow along. And the same thing tends to happen with faculty too, with larger meetings, that if you see that nearly everyone else has their camera off, you tend to turn yours off too. You know, so if you can talk to them about the advantages of being able to see each other's faces and so forth, and that if they're in an environment where they're able to do that, welcoming them turning on should not prohibit anyone who really is feeling uncomfortable turning it on from leaving theirs off. But it can make a difference, because sometimes just talking about how much you appreciate seeing students when they're able to do that will prompt that to swap, to flip around so that more students get it. And I've had classes where everyone kept their cameras on and I didn't have to say anything, but they tended to be smaller classes. They tended to be juniors or seniors who had often worked together more in the past, and they were just more comfortable with it. But in the large classes, it was very rare, maybe 5% or so would keep their cameras on when I had 289 students.
Right. Yeah, that's a challenge.
Yeah.
And Michael said, check-in days where you let the content arise from student-led conversations. That works well. Music and media, as mentioned, guest speakers is good. Provocative question prompts before going into breakout room. That's something you can use to provoke curiosity, get students thinking more deeply about it, and you can get some really good discussions going on. And again, students are so much more likely to actively discuss when they're a group of three or four people than they are when they're a group of 10 or 30 or 40. And we often find, you know, if we hop into those breakout rooms, that's some really active discussion going on within them. So using breakout rooms for small group instruction is really, for small group discussion, is really, really helpful. Other ways that you've used to engage students in remote instruction.
I'm here because I feel like I didn't effectively do it. So
I think we all felt that way.
Yeah, you're not alone.
And you know, part of it is with face-to-face classes, there's been a lot of research over centuries about what works. In online instruction, there's 30 plus years of research on what ways of engaging students asynchronously are effective. With remote instruction, with remote synchronous instruction, we know remarkably little about it. One thing we do know is that students learned a lot less on average, like maybe 20% less in some studies than compared to online, fully online asynchronous or face-to-face. And we know that, you know, there were some pretty dramatic losses, and that everyone reported less engagement. And the question is, how much of that is because of we didn't have a controlled experiment? We don't know whether that's due to the modality. We don't know if that's due to the trauma associated with the pandemic and the uncertainty that that brought in and the disruptions that that brought into everyone's lives. We don't know how much of it is because people were forced into a modality that they had not signed up for either students or faculty. And we don't know how much of it is that we just don't know really what's most effective. And much of what we've been talking about are active learning techniques that have been demonstrated from lots of research to be effective in classroom environments. We don't really know how effective they are remotely, and we're mostly still guessing about that. But logically, I think that a lot of what works, the ways in which active learning techniques work by engaging students with the content, with working with each other and reinforcing each other, it should work in the same way. That I don't see any logical reasons why it wouldn't, as long as the students are engaging in a similar way. But we're guessing, and we know it was a struggle for everyone, and we all were disappointed with how much students learned, you know, during that period. I think it was also true with face-to-face classes too.
John, what does research reveal in terms of asynchronous and synchronous comparison in terms of learning?
Initially, the results were really, really mixed. The early studies going back to the early 90s were about evenly split between those that found online instruction to be less effective and those that found it to be effective. However, over time, those results have pretty much converged. And the studies that found it to be more effective asynchronously were mostly studies that did not control for the characteristics of the student, that they did not control for the fact that online students tended to be older, they tended to have more prior courses, they tended to be more mature, they tended to have some experience working, and in general, they tended to have better study skills. So a lot of the early studies found that online work, the studies that found online work better were mostly ones that did not control for student background. The studies that found that face-to-face was better were mostly instructors who were trying to replicate what they were doing in the classroom in an online environment, recording lectures and posting them and thinking that they would work in the same way, giving students readings and the same types of tests they were using in class. And in general, if you try to replicate in an asynchronous environment the same sort of thing without that real-time interaction that you get in the classroom, it doesn't work as well. Over time, though, we've learned a lot about what's happened in terms of, we've learned a lot. I was just looking at the chat, I'm just trying, sorry, lack of focus there. We've learned a lot about what works well asynchronously, and we've learned a lot about what works better synchronously as well. And what most studies now find, including some large meta-analyses that have been studies of thousands of other studies, literally now, because we've got decades of this, generally find that there's no significant difference between asynchronous instruction and, asynchronous remote or asynchronous online instruction and synchronous face-to-face instruction in the classroom. However, the one thing that tends to work better than both is hybrid instruction when it's done well, when it's well-designed hybrid instruction. And these meta-analyses have found that those tend to be better when you use activities that work best in the classroom, and you use those techniques that work best asynchronously, you end up with significantly more learning taking place.
Thank you. You snatched my next question.
And there was, Lisa was asking about the participation museum slide. I think that was one of Rebecca's.
Yeah.
It
was a little bit earlier.
We can find that. Actually, I think I may have closed those slides. Actually, if you want to share, can you dig up the slide?
I don't need it right now. I'd never seen that before, and I like the idea of like
I was trying to remember
ways.
what it was. I think that was one of Rebecca's slides. What I can do is I can put the whole slideshow in the chat. Let me just make sure we have the right sharing permissions. Meanwhile, any other suggestions on things that you found that have worked well in a synchronous remote environment. Yes, and Ben just asked for this, so this is the whole slideshow. And that will have that museum, the participation museum slide. Well, any other questions, comments, thought? Okay. Music playing while students are, yeah, I can't remember. And I think it did say music participation museum or something. I think they were notes that Rebecca's students had posted, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, about like what makes participation good participation, or how to facilitate participation.
And it might have been a Jamboard. The reason I didn't think it was were the folds in the notes, and I don't think they come that way.
Yeah,
they
maybe
do.
not.
She
But
may
it's
have
a
also
it's a
taken some.
whiteboard tool,
Yeah.
like Jamboard.
Well, if there's no other questions or anyone else offering suggestions, I guess we can.
Yeah,
end.
I have heard some of the people who are working in say more prominent platforms. I had some from University of Virginia, Harvard, other places. And one of the things which I heard from them is that if you set the ground rules early on and spell it out nicely and try to conform to that, that would help. But be very articulate and very clear. These are the ground rules, and spell out some of the quick basics they need to know and the etiquettes of this kind of communication. Then that does help.
Yeah, and in general, providing students with more structure helps, giving them more clear instructions, more clear expectations, examples of high quality work, examples perhaps of lower quality work that they can view and evaluate to get a better feel for what they need to do. Again, there are some students who are going to excel no matter what we do in our classes. You know, they come in really well prepared. They often went to schools that prepared them really well for a college environment. Those are not our typical students. They never really were our typical students, but they're even less typical now than they were, say, 20 years ago. We have a lot of students who come in without as much preparation in terms of writing term papers, in terms of what you need to do to be successful in college classes. And the more we can provide students with information about what they need to do to be successful in our classes, the more successful they will be, which is probably not terribly surprising. But that structure makes a big difference. One of the first studies to find that was done by Kimberly Tanner about 20 years or so ago. And it's one of the main things that Vijay Sathi and Kelly Hogan have found in lots of their research, some of which they talked about at CIT and some of which they talked about last fall at the Academic Affairs Retreat. And their new book is coming out in about 5 or 6 weeks now. So, and that will also provide more information. Okay, well, I guess
We'll wrap
we're
up.
about out of time.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's great to see everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, John. And Meg, yes.
And I'm just getting to there we go.